People often ask me how I go about ordering wines when I'm at a restaurant. And so in this video, I'm going to go through my thought process and ordering strategy when I'm at a steakhouse. This is an area where I have a lot of experience since, as an attorney, I attend a lot of business dinners and I'm inevitably the one who makes the decisions on which wines to purchase. But in many of those instances, there's a strict budget with which we need to comply, and so it's important to try to maximize the budget by getting the best wine possible at the most affordable price possible. And this can be a real challenge at steakhouses because their wine lists oftentimes have substantial markups, as this is a popular venue for people to go on business dinners when they're not as price sensitive and when someone else is paying for the bill. To go through this exercise, we're going to be looking at the Del Frisco's wine list, but the points that I'll be making will be broadly applicable to any steakhouse wine list. While red wine and red meat are typically the main attraction, it's not at all uncommon for the undercard to include some sort of seafood, salads, or other appetizers that pair best with white wine. And so I'm going to start by going through the white wines on the by the glass list, and also some of the more attractively priced bottles that you might want to consider as an initial starting point. After that, we're going to turn to the red wines. I'll identify my by the glass selection, and then discuss some of the bottles at two different price points. First, those that are the most cost-effective possible in terms of maximizing the quality for a relatively low price. After that, I'm going to identify some red wines that cost a little bit more, but which are relative values on this wine list because they're regions that don't typically get the same amount of attention at these steakhouses. Lastly, we're going to go through the most fun part of the exercise, which is the wines that I would order if I was celebrating a big closing, after winning a big trial, or if money was otherwise no object. Starting with the by the glass list for sparkling wine and champagne is oftentimes a bit of a challenge at a steakhouse. As you can see here, many of the selections are a little bit uninspiring and predictable, and they also have huge markups. I'm not normally a fan of Prosecco, but here they have an interesting choice from the Bisol family. Bisol is one of the top producers of Prosecco that's been a family-owned winery that is now controlled by Gianluca Bisol, who's the 21st generation owner of Bisol. This is not any Prosecco, it's Prosecco Valdobbiadene. Valdobbiadene is one of the best areas for Prosecco. It's a UNESCO heritage site that's nestled between the Dolomites and Venice. And this Prosecco is only about $14 a glass, so it'll certainly be friendly on the wallet, although the markup is a little bit higher than I'd prefer. This also means, though, that it's one that you might want to keep an eye out if you're looking for a bottle at a retail store, as you can probably get a bottle for around $14 or $15 as well, and this would be a nice sparkling wine to enjoy at your house. But if you don't want to get a sparkling wine, if you want to proceed to start with a white wine, there's two of these options that catch my eye. Chablis is always a great choice to start with. It has refreshing acidity, and it often pairs extremely well with the sorts of preliminary courses that you would get, such as seafood-based appetizers and salads and the like. This particular one is about $20 a glass, and so it might be a pretty good option for you to consider. The other wine that catches my eye is Pinot Grigio, and while Pinot Grigio is not something that I typically get excited about, this is definitely a reputable producer. At $16 a glass, the markup on this one is not so bad, as this one sells for around $24 a bottle retail. And another interesting approach to keep in mind when you're ordering at a restaurant is that if you're ordering for a group, you want to get something that can be neutral and that's not going to offend anyone. And so Pinot Grigio can sometimes fill that role, especially when it's from a solid producer such as this one. But I must say that I think we can definitely do much better than this if we go to by the bottle selection when it comes to the white wines at the Del Frisco Steakhouse. But before we do that, I want to give you a quick tip for the by the glass list. That's something that's worked very, very well for me over the years. And that is, if I'm torn between two wines, such as the Pinot Grigio or the Chablis, for example, I'll ask the waiter for a small tasting sip of both of them. And that way I can try them both and make a more informed decision about which one to order. And I've never had a waiter tell me no when I've made that request. So definitely give that a try the next time you're trying to decide between two wines by the glass. If the person scrutinizing your expense reports is anything like mine, you probably want to try to stick to $100 a bottle or less, and that's particularly true for the white wine. And so I was very pleased to see this next wine on the wine list. Somewhat surprisingly, this wine flies under the radar despite the fact that it's a white Burgundy and it's also from an estate that's owned by famed co-owner of Domaine Romanée-Conti, Albert du Villain. This is a wine that saved me on many a business occasion, especially when I'm in expensive cities such as Miami ordering seafood. I'm talking about the Domaine du Villain Bouzeron Aligoté. Aligoté is the second white grape that's permitted in Burgundy, but it very much flies under the radar. And so this is a wine that you can often find on wine lists for only $90 or $95 per bottle, but it punches well above that price point, and it's certainly an excellent wine and one that's been well received every time I've ordered it. This wine pairs extraordinarily well with seafood and is another one that you'd want to consider for your collection at home as well. You can oftentimes get this bottle for around $50 or less in the United States. If your guests insist on getting a Chardonnay, my recommendation would be the 2016 Mayacamas Chardonnay. This is an exceptional producer, and this is not your typical Chardonnay from California. They don't use a lot of new oak on this one, only a couple percent, and they also suppress malolactic fermentation. As a result, this has much higher acidity than many Chardonnays from Napa. This wine is not quite as good a value from a cost perspective as the Aligoté, because this one sells for about $50 on release, and it's around $115 on this wine list. Nevertheless, if your guests insist on Chardonnay, this is not a bad buy, as Chardonnay tends to be quite marked up on some of these steakhouse wine lists as well, because many people seek it out and ask for it. We're going to move on to the red wines in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to point out a few exceptional values in the white wine category that I saw by the bottle. The first of which is the Müller-Courtois Riesling. This is a dry Riesling that sells for $75 a bottle. It costs about $30 retail, and it's probably an excellent value at that price point. So you could do a lot worse than this one, and if you have some Riesling fans in your group, I would definitely consider this one. And if you really have a low budget, or if you prefer to spend a little bit more on your red wines and want to minimize the white wine expense, then you definitely want to consider two of the $55 bottles. One is the Vietti Roero Arnese. This is an excellent white wine that tends to go extremely well with these starter courses. And the other wine is from Alsace, and that is from excellent producer Domaine Weinbach, specifically the Pinot Blanc that sells for around $55 as well. And with that, we're ready to move on to the red wines. We'll start with the by the glass choices. Although they have a number of choices by the glass, in my view, there's one that stands head and shoulders above the rest, and which I would highly recommend. In fact, this is a wine that I ordered by the bottle at a steakhouse in Manhattan just a couple of weeks ago, and everyone in my group really enjoyed it, and it was only about $90 a bottle. This excellent wine comes from famous Super Tuscan producer Ornellaia, and it's actually the third wine from Ornellaia, called Le Volte. This wine is $18 a glass at Del Frisco. This is a wine that's a blend of Merlot and Sangiovese and Cabernet Sauvignon. The Merlot helps to keep this wine softer, the Sangiovese gives it some nice acidity, and the Cabernet gives it a little bit of structure. But make no mistake, this is a wine that's designed for early consumption, and that's what makes it such a terrific choice. This is a wine that you can just open and pop and pour, and it's ready to go. While we're talking about the Ornellaia third wine, it's worth noting that one big picture observation that may help you in the future is that it's often a good choice to seek out a second or third wine from a top producer on the wine list at a steakhouse. This is so because these wines are made in an approachable style and they're designed to be enjoyed when they're young. In contrast, the top wine from Ornellaia may have a bigger name and more cachet, but it may not be as enjoyable when it's young as this third wine, because that's a wine that is designed to age for a substantial period of time before you enjoy it, and which may be too structured and tannic if you open it right away. So moving on to the by the bottle selection for the red wines, the first place I always start when I'm looking at the wine list at a steakhouse is Napa. And of course, at most steakhouses, Napa Cabernet is king. The problem, however, is that even though they have a very good selection with lots of depth and many vintages, they oftentimes mark these up dramatically, and it's not uncommon to see 400% markups or so. And so what I like to do is I have a reference wine, and I'll just check that reference wine. It'll be one that's typically on most of these lists, such as Chateau Montelena, and that's a wine that I know sells for around $80 to $85 on release at retail. And so I quickly check the price of that wine on this list and find that it's $295 or more, depending on the vintage. So, in other words, I've confirmed that the markup is a little bit rich and that I'm probably better off looking elsewhere for my red wine by the bottle. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. But nevertheless, if your guests insist on getting a Napa Cabernet, or if you really want one yourself, my recommendation would be the Mathiasen. Mathiasen is a classic producer in Napa, so you don't have to worry about this one being too oaky or cloyingly sweet. It's a very well-balanced wine and one that I think that most people would enjoy. This one sells for $150 on the Del Frisco's list, and it's one that's about $65 or $70 retail. So it's only about a little bit more than a double markup, which isn't too bad, especially for the Napa Cabernet section. Once I've determined that the markups on Napa Cabernet are excessive, I'll typically proceed to the California section that has listings for grapes like Merlot or Petite Sirah. These are oftentimes much better values. One of the options you'll see here, for example, is a Mayacamas Merlot that sells for $140 a bottle. Mayacamas is an outstanding producer, and this is a wine that should also be approachable and ready to enjoy right away with a pop and pour. This is a wine that sells for around $70 to $75 a bottle, and it's around $140 on the list. So not too bad in terms of markup, and certainly much less of a markup than you'll find in the Cabernet section. Petite Sirah from Napa Valley is another wine that I'll often rely on when I'm at a steakhouse. Here, for example, you can get the Stag's Leap Petite Sirah for around $95 a bottle, and the Stag's Leap Cabernet is $135 or so a bottle. Most people who enjoy Stag's Leap Cabernet would also enjoy the Petite Sirah, but yet you'll save $35 to $40 a bottle by making that switch. Petite Sirah can have a little bit more tannin than Napa Cabernet, so it may be a good idea to get the ribeye with this one, as the additional fat from the ribeye will help to soften the tannins. Before we move on to the next wine selection, I'll give you one more tip that's helped me over the years, and that is to make sure that you have 2 or 3 picks in mind and that you prioritize them. I can't tell you how many times a waiter will come back to me and say that a wine that I've ordered is no longer in stock. This is particularly true because many restaurants don't keep the same volume of inventory in their wine cellar that they used to. They have to run a tighter ship because of the struggling economic times that we're facing currently. And so for that reason, you'll definitely want to make sure you have a couple selections ready to go. The last thing you want to do is, having spent 5 to 10 minutes making a selection, have to go back and spend another 5 to 10 minutes poring over the wine list to come up with an alternate pick. Other places on steakhouse wine lists that are worth checking for value options include Chile and Spain. Here, for example, I note that there's 2 different options of Don Melchor, which is an outstanding Cabernet Sauvignon-based wine from Napa Valley. This wine sells for about $140 on release. It's typically very highly acclaimed year in and year out, and here you'll see that they're right around $200 or perhaps a little bit more for these wines. So certainly something that offers some favorable relative value compared to many of the wines on this wine list. In terms of the Spanish section, I also see a wine that certainly catches my attention, and that is the Flor de Pingas. Dominio de Pingas is one of the top cult wines in all of Spain. It's extremely expensive and very hard to come by. This Flor de Pingas is the second wine of that outstanding producer, and it typically sells for close to $100 in the United States, so to be able to get this second wine for $198 off a restaurant list is certainly an excellent proposition and one that I would definitely want to take advantage of. Before we get to the fun part of the video, where I talk about the wines I would get if money were no object, I wanted to first bring up another scenario that sometimes comes up at the end of the night, and that is, you've already largely exhausted your budget and you're all kind of sitting around wondering whether to stay or go, but you all decide that you should get one more bottle of wine. And in that instance, you sometimes need a wine that's very reasonably priced, and you're typically talking about a red wine. So here, one wine that may fill that role is the 2013 North Star Merlot. Like Chile and Spain, Washington is oftentimes an excellent source for value, and Washington Merlot has certainly a good reputation. This wine has a few years of additional bottle age. It's definitely going to be one that you could pop in, pour, and enjoy immediately. It's a $40 wine that sells for only $70 on this wine list, so certainly a very gentle markup for this one. So now we're to the part of the video for those who have no budgetary constraints at all. This is always the most fun part of the video, and I'm going to start by getting a champagne. I've reviewed the white wines by the bottle, and while there's some nice choices, there's nothing that's overly exciting, and certainly nothing that excites me as much as this 2004 Salon. While 2004 is certainly very young for Salon, and this one will improve for decades in the bottle, it nevertheless is always a treat to have Salon, and so you really can't go wrong with this one. It's right around $998 a bottle, and so that's how we're going to start things off. And with respect to the red, if you're looking for the ultimate way to impress your guests, you'll definitely want to go to DRC. And they have an excellent selection of DRC wines on this list. My personal favorite would probably come from the La Tâche area. So they have 2014 La Tâche for around $5,500 and 2015 La Tâche for around $6,000. So we may as well go with the 2015 and spend the $6,000 since money is no object. If, however, you prefer Bordeaux, or you'd want to rein things in a little bit and spend closer to $2,500, I would definitely consider the 1998 Haut-Brion. Many of the Bordeaux on this list are still quite young and are not in their prime drinking window, and I've found that 2000 Bordeaux is in a bit of a shutdown phase right now. So I'm definitely waiting another year or so on my 2000 Bordeaux, but this 1998 Haut-Brion I had about 6 months ago, and it showed extremely well. So you could definitely do a lot worse than this one. And while it's not on this wine list for the Dallas location, I did find a 1982 Mouton on the list at the Washington, D.C. location of Del Frisco's. So that would certainly be an excellent choice as well, and that would set you back around $3,500 a bottle. If you'd like to know my ordering strategy for the French Laundry wine list, please check out the video in the pinned comment below.